Do you think your prayers are not effective? What do you do when there's a delay in answered prayers? The book of Samuel gives us an idea. The first two chapters put two characters in the spotlight, Hannah and Eli. One was a desperate woman without child, seemingly ashamed of her situation. Another was the priest in God's temple, a respectable position. But as it turns out later, their situations would be reversed. Hannah would be the one blessed by God with a child, Samuel, while Eli and his family would be brought down. We know the whole story and the big picture. Samuel was crucial in God's plan to deal with Eli and his sinful sons and to eventually take leadership of Israel. He would help Israel to subdue the Philistines who kept invading them. He would also be Israel's last judge. Samuel's mom Hannah knew nothing about what was to come. She was just praying for a child, perhaps out of her rivalry with Peninnah or self-longing. But it was not until she was finally ready to release him to God's service that the boy Samuel was even conceived. God was preparing her even before she could see evidence of an answered prayer. So Hannah's story shows us how a delay in answered prayer can be God's way of preparing our hearts and turning us towards His purposes. Unfortunately, Israel did not follow Hannah's footsteps. Their hearts did not turn to God's purposes, but rather to their own desires to have a king like the other nations. This is foretold in Deuteronomy chapter 17. They preferred the security of having a human king to lead and follow, rather than the King of Kings. And all this happened in spite of God's warnings. Likewise, we ought to be careful not to let our desires deviate us from God's will and purposes. Follow Hannah's example. Even though she might have initially desired a child out of rivalry or personal interest, she eventually traded that in by dedicating the child to God's service. Do we have any desires that need to be traded in for God's purposes? Are our hearts and character ready to receive the answer to our prayers? Take delight in God and seek Him. Then our hearts and desires will align with Him.